Fascism, Ray.
Yeah.
Fascism, fascism, fascism.
My favorite.
Fascism, fascism, fascism.
My favorite topic.
I
Yeah.
I have been threatening to do this
You have.
for quite a while now.
You have.
Yeah. Fascism, what does it bring to mind? Marching boots, fiery rallies, authoritarian rulers.
Yeah. Shouting.
Charismatic authoritarian rulers.
Spittle coming from the mouth. Yeah. No, all that good stuff. All that good stuff.
It's a word that gets bandied around a lot, particularly in the US at the moment from the left. But it might be overused. What is fascist? What is not fascist? As it turns out, it's surprisingly hard to pin down.
Yes.
What fascism is. I remember back when we were in Vegas in 2016.
Wow.
Having dinner with a group of us, you, me, Tony Kynaston, Chrissy, a few of the fans, and David Markham was there, and Trump was running for the first time for the nomination for the Republican Party at the time,
Right.
and David was assuring me that he wasn't gonna get the nomination. I was like, I don't know. And then as he did, and he was sort of running, I was posting on Facebook saying that the US was heading down a fascist road. David was assuring me that Trump wasn't a fascist,
right?
That there was no fascism, there couldn't be fascism. There weren't any brown shirts,
right,
associated with Trump,
right,
and MAGA.
Yeah.
And my response at the time was, look, you wouldn't expect fascism in the United States in the 21st century to look like fascism in Germany or Italy or Spain in the early 20th century.
Absolutely.
Because there are different conditions.
Yeah.
But it does raise the question, so what is fascism? How do we know it's fascism?
Yeah.
And I wanted to do this series. I've been reading books on fascism, well, for many, many decades, actually. But over the last year or two, I've been reading more and more contemporary books on fascism, trying to figure out, what is it? What does it look like? How do we know if something is fascism? It's like the monkey or the Scopes trial in America. No, not the monkey trial, the pornography trial that you had famously with some judge, one of your famous Supreme Court judges said, I know it when I see it, in terms of pornography.
Exactly.
And please just send me all your pornography, because I'm not quite sure just yet.
More research.
More
research. No, but you're right. Yeah. I mean, you're right. If you're expecting to see someone in a brown shirt marching down the street speaking German, it's not going to happen in America. Or a black shirt or silver shirt speaking Italian, it's not going to happen. But there are parallels as we're going to as we dive down to this, and I think that's what throws some people off. They're like, "Well, it's not like that, so it can't be fascism." Well, like you said, it's hard to pin down. It comes in many forms, not unlike my lovemaking. So again, let's drill down into it, make some comparisons, and try to come up with, I don't know, an indication of where America is and maybe where we're going.
Like, there are various forms of right-wing authoritarian governments, and they're not all necessarily fascist. The US has a long history of right-wing populism and various attempts to protect or bring back some form of white supremacy. Are they fascist, or are they just right-wing populism, right-wing conservative, far right-wing conservative movements? I want to better understand the terms. So this is what we're going to start today on the Bullshit Filter. It's buckle up, buttercup. It's not going to be a short process, as is my want. Oh, shout out to Doug Onsey from Boston. Doug was in Brisbane yesterday on his annual trip out here, and we went out to breakfast, had a lovely chat. And he was complaining about how long the Da Vinci series went.
What?
But yeah, I was like, how can you complain about Da Vinci? Yeah. But he said, I just want you to get on to Michelangelo. And I said, well, we've already recorded the first couple of episodes. Yeah. They're not out yet, but you'll be happy to know that we've started that process.
You happy now?
Yes, because Michelangelo, he's actually a great artist. Da Vinci, is he that great? He said, I look at the Mona Lisa and I'm like, yeah. Anyway. We're going to do a long series on fascism, probably. No, I don't know how long. It's not going to be Da Vinci long.
No, we'll say this. But, I did want to ask one question before we get into this, because you just said something that triggered something, bringing up America's past. Obviously, with the way America handled itself during the Cold War, we certainly sidled up to a lot of right-wing governments, dictators, or whatever. And so, in your opinion, because I'm trying to ask someone who's not American, do you think that maybe that made America in general more, I'm not even sure the word, tolerant to being on the far right versus the far left? Because for decades we've been pounded the idea of if you go to the left and you're socialism, you're bad because they were the enemy. You go to the far right, they kind of helped us during the Cold War. So I don't know. I was just, again, the American government, the CIA, got very comfortable with a lot of far right-wing governments. And I wonder if that kind of also skews the view of a lot of Americans. Right?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think America has always been, fairly right-leaning.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it started off as a country that was formed by a bunch of religious fundamentalists who wanted to set up, their own country where they could practice their own sort of religious fundamentalism, running away from other religious fundamentalists in England, I might add.
Right.
And then they went and they, basically carried out a slow-moving form of genocide on the indigenous population.
Yeah.
Had slaves, which they treated as subhuman
right.
to build their economy. And the country's always been run by a wealthy elite. Somebody sent me an email yesterday, one of our listeners, and asked the question about why it is that we being Western countries tend to go through periods of a lot of progressive progress, and then it sort of gets rescinded or pushed back that progress that we make.
Right.
And I said, look, I think it's complicated, but there are various reasons why governments allow progressive legislation to move through, and it's not always because the government itself holds progressive views. Sometimes it's used to shut down truly progressive movements.
Yeah.
As
Very
remember
Bismarckian.
FDR said.
Yeah.
Yes, Bismarckian, and we'll talk about Bismarck a bit over these episodes. I remember FDR saying to the Wall Street bankers during the Great Depression when he was pushing through some progressive ideas,
right,
is like, better that I do it than the guys with the pitchforks and the torches do it, right? I'm your...
Exactly. Your least bad way to do this. Yeah, because I'm one of you.
Because I'm a rich blue blood guy, right? But if we don't give them something, they're going to storm the castle.
They're going to take everything.
Basically. Let's
So let's
give them bread and circuses to keep them happy, so we can still. Anyway,
exactly.
So back to fascism. Is it an ideology of extreme nationalism? Is it a mass movement that's fueled by anger and fear? Is it a style of political rhetoric that divides us and them? Is it just any kind of one-party dictatorship? And the answer seems to be, it's all of those things.
Pretty much.
In various combinations.
Yeah.
At different times and different places. Fascism comes in different forms, but trying to figure out exactly what makes something fascist is tricky.
Right.
So there's a lot of different ways that we can break this down. And, some of the scholars that have studied this for decades, I'll talk about, is historian Robert Paxton, who's studied this a lot. He defines fascism as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity carried out by a nationalist mass movement that abandons democratic liberties and pursues goals of internal cleansing and external expansion without restraint.
Nailed it. Pretty much nailed. Yeah. And the answer has to be that wide, because as we're going to see, a lot of the early parts of fascism, believe it or not, they weren't just say, hey, let's be jerks. They were literally trying to solve problems as they saw them in their country at different times in history. So again, as we're going to see this, they were like, okay, well, we need to do something that could be considered extreme, like fascism, because the problem is so big, or maybe we've lost our way as ethnically or race or culturally or whatever. So again, they weren't just setting out to be jerks. They literally thought these were some of the things they needed to do to solve very big problems, as we're going to get to later. But yeah, when I tried to look up a definition, it said, while we don't have a single universally agreed upon definition, there are features of it. And you just touched on a lot of them right there. But a lot of that is what makes the average person kind of nervous, because they don't know where they stand. If they're in with the new leader and the new leader's philosophy, all good. If they're not, their life could become very difficult very quickly. And we'll get into some of that. But yeah, it is very nebulous. And that's one of the reasons why, and you said this at the beginning, people probably throw around the word way more than they should.
Political philosopher Jason Stanley, who's written a great book on fascism, sort of defines it as a cult of a strong leader who promises national restoration, scapegoating minorities and opponents as traitors, and claims only he can solve the nation's problems.
Right.
Leon Trotsky, who wrote a lot about fascism in the 30s when it was emerging as a major force in Europe.
Right.
He said its historic function is to smash the working class, destroy its organizations, and stifle political liberties when the capitalists find themselves unable to govern with the help of democratic machinery.
Yeah, it's certainly in there.
And I've always looked to Trotsky's definitions of this, think what you might about Trotsky, but he understood political movements. I mean, he was really the guy behind the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin might have been the strategic thinker, but it was Trotsky who actually made it happen.
Right.
The questions, when I start a show like this, and I try to understand a topic, my process is, first of all, to just jot down what are the questions that I want to answer for myself. What are the things that are kind of bugging me? So the questions I had for this were, what is fascism actually? How do we define it? How do we recognize it? And then, is it necessarily a bad thing? We just assume that it's a bad thing, but is it? And if so, why? Who says fascism is a bad thing? Why is it a bad thing? Then the next level is the United States becoming fascist? Is Donald Trump a fascist? And if so, why? And if so, is that a bad thing? And why? What is the ideological structure of fascism? I guess that's the root of all of this. And then the other thing is, and this is something that Doug and I were talking about over breakfast yesterday, if the US is becoming a fascist country, why? And how did that happen to the richest and most powerful country, not only on earth, but probably in history?
Right.
Like, we historically associate 20th century fascism, Germany, Italy, Spain, with countries that had deep, deep economic problems. And they'd suffered from recent wars. They'd come through World War I. They'd gone through civil wars in the case of Spain. There was Germany and Italy had just gone through unification, which was a painful process, and then their involvements in World War I to various levels of success and failure.
Right.
And they had large populations of people that had lived through the horrors of all of this and were looking for answers. How do we rebuild our once proud countries? The United States, on the other hand, is incredibly wealthy and successful and should be a land of milk and honey where everyone is just living the dream. So for a country like that to go fascist, you have to wonder what the underlying causes are.
Right.
I mean, we can pull stuff out of our socks like, well, there's a big disenfranchised working class that feel betrayed by the elite over decades as jobs have been offshored. That, I think does explain a lot of Trump's popularity. But anyway, let's start with the bullshit filter drill. What are the two things that we need to think about, Ray, when we dive into a complex topic that I've been drilling into everybody for the last 10 years?
Epistemology, heuristics. Those are the two.
Good man. Look, I've trained you well.
Boom.
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 I didn't even prep you on that. I'm
you beat it into me.
Impressed.
I don't know if you should be proud of that. Well, you are. You know what? Never mind. Go ahead.
So for new listeners, my approach for many years, if I'm trying to get my head around a complicated topic, is to start by breaking it down into epistemology and heuristics. Epistemology, how do we know what is true in this particular domain? What are the rules for determining truth in this particular subject? And they're different from subject to subject. If you're talking about a scientific question, does evolution exist? Is evolution real? Are vaccines dangerous? Did COVID come out of a Chinese lab? Whatever the question is, there are certain ways that you approach scientific truth.
Right.
Things that can be supported by evidence and hypotheses, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have murkier issues that are sociological and aren't or religious. They're not as easily broken down into a hypothesis and supporting evidence because they're sort of more fluffy. So there are different ways that you have to approach the question of how do we know what is true. And, this is one of those. As I said before, there's a lot of different definitions and a lot of debate around it. So it's obviously a murkier subject, being a sociological question. Heuristics is, okay, I'm never going to be an expert on anything apart from lovemaking.
That's true. That's actually true. Go ahead.
It is. Ray can attest to my skills in that area. So who do I turn to be my trusted guide on this topic? I need a credible person, or preferably a credible body of long-standing, made up of experts. If that body doesn't exist, who are the individuals that have exceptional credibility in this domain that I can turn to and trust to guide me through it? Because I'm not going to be an expert, and it's easy to find. Like, there are so-called experts on everything, like us, but you need to be careful about where you go to get your experts from. Somebody with a podcast is not necessarily an expert,
right?
Except us,
of course, or even
on
just
all things.
Exactly, or just because they happen to agree with what you think, obviously as well, does not make them an expert. So, just beware.
Yeah. You don't know when to end up in one of these feedback loops.
Exactly.
So let's start with the epistemology. As I said, not a hard science when you're talking about social movements like this. There are lots of different opinions and variations. We can look at the history of fascism, but even then, German fascism looked different to Italian fascism, which looked different to Spanish fascism. And not all expressions of fascism, even in the early 20th century, ticked all of the boxes. So you wouldn't expect modern 21st century fascism to look the same as any one of those. But there are recurring motifs, recurring strategies that seem to appear. A mythic past, scapegoating, propaganda, hierarchy. Again, another quote from Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Works. Fascist politics include many distinct strategies: the mythic past, propaganda, anti-intellectualism, unreality, hierarchy, victimhood, law and order, sexual anxiety, appeals to the heartland, and a dismantling of public welfare and unity. Michael Mann, who's another scholar whose book I've read, he wrote a book called Fascists back about 20 odd years ago, says fascism is the pursuit of a transcendent and cleansing nation-statism through paramilitarism.
Yeah. Nationalism narrowly defined, even more narrowly defined, with more and more people finding themselves on the outside looking in, even though they're citizens of that same nation. So it becomes about either ethnically or racially pure. They're solving a problem. There's a strong man involved. And it's going to take sacrifice and struggle to solve whatever the problem is. Of course, that struggle normally is the people, some of the people themselves suffering. So again, it's not for the faint of heart, but these were people, again, who thought they were dealing with very large issues that needed extreme answers.
But you could also apply some of these things to other forms of government as well. People might say that communism or socialism led by a vanguard of the elite in China in the middle 20th century, or the Soviet Union in the early middle 20th century, had elements of this as well. So you've got supposedly a far left authoritarian government, a far right authoritarian government. They're with common elements.
Absolutely.
Not column.
No.
Column eminence.
Or colon.
No.
Not colon. Definitely.
Colon. It's just telling Ray you got to eat a lot of fiber. Keep your colon elements in moving.
A healthy colon is a happy colon, people. Don't ever forget that.
So look, from an epistemology perspective, I think I want to look at the history, but then also determine truth by relying on the heuristics, relying on the experts who have studied this. There's no one body that I can turn to that I think is there's no version of the World Health Organization for fascism.
The definitive, yeah.
But there are a list of scholars ranging from historians to philosophers to democracy studies that I'm going to refer to over the course of the series. Robert Paxton, who I mentioned, he wrote a book called The Anatomy of Fascism. He's the most cited modern historian. Stanley Payne, A History of Fascism. Timothy Snyder, On Tyranny. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. Jason Stanley, who I mentioned, his book, How Fascism Works, more recent, about 9 or 10 years old. Umberto Eco, Fascism, essay that he wrote 30 years ago. He gives a list of 14 features of fascism. Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, not strictly fascism, but compares fascism and Stalinism.
Right.
Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt wrote a book called How Democracies Die. Again, not fascism per se, but looks at how authoritarian practices creep into democracies. Juan Linz wrote a book, Totalitarian and Authoritarian Regimes. Michael Mann, I mentioned before, wrote this book, Fascists, in 2004, which I enjoyed. And, of course, Trotsky. I go back to Trotsky because he was one of the earliest authors to write a critique during real time as he was watching. He had obviously his own agenda.
Right.
And he was writing this when he'd been kicked out of the Soviet Union. He was living in exile and waiting for the inevitable ice pick. But he was studying what was going on. He was a critic of Stalin. A critic of Stalin. He was a critic of Hitler.
Right.
He was a critic of Mussolini. So he was on the sidelines as a guy who dedicated his life to revolution.
Yeah.
But examining and studying what was going on in these fascist countries. Let me start with a couple of quotes from him. To understand the dialectic of the relation among the three classes, we must differentiate three historical stages. At the dawn of capitalistic development, when the bourgeoisie required revolutionary methods to solve its tasks, in the period of bloom and maturity of the capitalist regime, when the bourgeoisie endowed its domination with orderly, pacific, conservative, democratic forms, finally, at the decline of capitalism, when the bourgeoisie is forced to resort to methods of civil war against proletariat to protect its right of exploitation. So Trotsky very much saw fascism as a tool of the capitalists when the rest of their tools to control the population started to flounder. The middle class, the petty bourgeoisie, and the elite would turn to fascism to reassert control over the working classes.
Yeah.
Now, we know certainly in Germany in the early 20th century, in Italy in the early 20th century, that was, largely true. They were fighting, Mussolini and Hitler were both fighting against the growing socialist/communist movements in their country.
Yeah.
Working classes were rising. They were unhappy with what capitalism was doing to them, among other things. And these guys were trying to shut that down and reassert the control of the capitalists / the state to varying degrees. It was this corporatism, statism sort of hybrid model. Trotsky has another line that I've always referred to over the decades as my starting point. He says, at the moment that the normal police and military resources of the bourgeois dictatorship, together with their parliamentary screens, no longer suffice to hold society in a state of equilibrium, the turn of the fascist regime arrives. Through the fascist agency, capitalism sets in motion the masses of the crazed petty bourgeoisie and the bands of declassed and demoralized lumpen proletariat, all the countless human beings whom finance capital itself has brought to desperation and frenzy. Yeah, I mean, essentially, if you think about what we said earlier about the United States, we know that there's a lot of disenfranchised working class that have seen the centralization of agriculture. They've seen the manufacturing get offshored. The people whose parents and grandparents had well-paying jobs and could live a good life in the 50s, 60s, 70s, working in manufacturing, have seen that move offshore to China, to India, to Vietnam, to Mexico over the last 30-odd years, and their incomes have stagnated, whilst certain elements of the population, I was talking to Doug about this yesterday, like the stock market is booming in the US.
If you got money and stock, life's good right now. If you don't, you're missing out. Yeah.
Trump said he was going to bring down prices. In fact, he threw tariffs on everything, so prices are going up.
Right. He's playing the long game.
Some of it's being,
Sorry.
Yeah. What he's going to do is crash the economy, then prices will go down.
So technically,
it's all good.
Yeah. No, I think, and just to add on to what you're saying, I think a lot of people, and this is not fact as in base, I can show you statistics, but the general feeling for a lot of Americans right now is, I feel like this is the first time that the generation that's coming after me is actually going to do worse. Because that's part of the American dream, right? Each generation does a little bit better, whether it's education or hard work or opportunity, economic opportunity. And there's a lot of people now that just feel like, we're just not heading in fact, we're heading in the wrong direction. And when you get panic like that, when you get fear like that, people, maybe they assume that the solution to whatever is something more extreme. So again, it just makes, it leaves the field open for people like Trump to come along, say kind of extreme, outrageous things, and people to go, you know what? Yeah, if he can do it, I will back him, even though I normally wouldn't back him at a different time. And again, that's what fascism does. Like a lot of other governments, it takes advantage of whatever's going on at the time, normally bad stuff in a country.
I mean, there is stats that back that up. Surveys. I've got a Gallup poll here from April 2025. Most notably, since January, Americans' 6-month outlooks for economic growth and the stock market have turned from positive to negative, while their forecasts for inflation, interest rates, and the job market have dimmed.
Yeah.
In line with those changes, Gallup's yearly reading on Americans' assessment of their personal finances shows a record high 53% now believing their situation is getting worse. This marks the first time in the trend dating back to 2001 that a majority have expressed financial pessimism. So people feel like things are getting worse, despite what Trump's supporters will tell you. So back to Trotsky.
Yeah, which just flies in the face of, you're supposed to be loyal to the leader. Let me ask you a quick question about Trotsky real quick, because I'm sure you know a lot more about him than I do. Would it be fair to say, because like you were saying a minute ago, for a while, he was making manifest Lenin's ideas. Lenin was the intellectual. Lenin was the thinker. Stalin hasn't quite come along yet. He was just one of the many cogs. Anyways, would it be fair to say or to assess that maybe Trotsky's looking at it now that he's in Latin America, he's running for his life. He's like, we had an idea, we had a purpose, and then either Lenin and or more likely Stalin has taken our goal, our dream, but this machine that we built, and they kind of ran with it for their own purposes. Because as we're going to see probably in the second show, when we start talking about some of Mussolini's ideas, you're going to agree with the vast majority of his ideas. Like, this sounds pretty good. But again, somewhere along the way, the movement gets hijacked. And it becomes more about Mussolini than actually fixing the state. So I was just wondering if Trotsky's sitting there going, we had it started, we were doing it, and then something went off the rails, whether it was Lenin, whether it was Stalin, I don't know. But I always got the sense that he was like, we were sincere when we started out.
Yeah, I can't speak for Trotsky, but he was he and Lenin, like any partnership, criticized each other from time to time.
Right.
And it wasn't always a smooth working relationship, but he and Lenin were pretty tight. Gave each other lots of pats on the back over the years until Lenin died. He and Stalin obviously, hated each other.
Yeah.
They were fighting for control of where things went. Stalin won. So, obviously Trotsky felt like Stalin screwed it up. He spent the rest of his life criticizing Stalin and the direction he'd taken the Soviet Union in.
Good point.
And Russia in. So you would expect that. But, I do believe that Trotsky felt like his view for Russia was the right one. But I also think Stalin felt his view for Russia was the right one.
Right.
And as I think Hitler and Mussolini thought that their views for their respective countries were the right ones and they were doing the right thing.
Right.
And that's interesting because I was going to ask you about this. I mean, you know a lot about Hitler, a lot about Mussolini. It's funny because when I look at Trump, I don't believe that Trump thinks he's doing the right thing for America. I think Trump thinks he's doing the right thing for Trump.
Good point.
And for the Trump family finances.
Very good point.
I do believe that Mussolini and Hitler believed in their mission, their ideological mission for making their country great and strong.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just about blatant grift and graft.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good point, because when we get to Mussolini in 1919 and he has this statement, he's like, Italy and all of Europe, we need to work on these problems together. We need to solve border disputes. We need to bring peace, and we need to move everybody forward. I mean, it's like kumbaya. It's pretty amazing. Hitler, he said the right words, but his idea was always to build up the German state and to conquer as much of Europe as he could. But again, that's kind of good for Germany. It's good for him, but it's also good for Germany. So you've got Mussolini starts out sincere, Hitler 50% sincere, but I think you're absolutely right. I never thought about that before. Then there's Trump, and you can love Trump, hate Trump, or whatever, but if you don't think that he's constantly thinking, how does this benefit me? I mean, at the very least, like lowering the interest rates because he owes so much money. I mean, but that's a brilliant point, because this goes back to something you said at the very beginning. For some people, or for some times and countries, the definition of fascism doesn't work. And as we're going to talk about later, I'm sure. And one of the ways that doesn't work here is that Trump is just doing what the fuck, whatever he wants. What mood is he in today? How's this going to benefit him? How's it going to make him money? That's not fascism. That's just egotism. But again, that's a very good distinction that I think probably a lot of people just go right by, because they just label him fascist-like, and they don't think about it anymore.
And I don't know whether or not you need a leader that really believes in the religiosity of the mission for it to be fascism. But That is one thing that jumps out at me. Like, I believe that Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and Putin and Xi Jinping all are trying to do the right thing for the strength and security and prosperity of their countries.
Yeah.
In every case, they're also trying to keep their jobs and, be successful.
Yeah.
There's nothing surprising about that. They all want to stay in power and make money along the way and build their own personal security, financial security, whatever.
Oh, yes.
But I don't see any of them doing their versions of a Trump coin or a Trump phone, or, blatantly just trying to
hawk.
They might be skimming off the top quietly, secretly somewhere doing that.
But that's how you do it. That's
different.
That's the traditional way. That's why you go into power, because you wet your beak. when Trump is selling sneakers, and I think his wife has got a new perfume. There's something coming out for Christmas. I can't remember, but that's just blatant. I'm just abusing the hell out of my position and the fact that people love me and they will buy whatever the fuck I stamp my name on. But you make a good right. That is a distinction. That is where, and we'll get to this later, Trump is in a category all fuck by himself, but we'll get into that. But yeah, no, again, and that's just another reason for the people that don't like him have something concrete to point to, because he's just hawking his wares in the White House.
Okay, so back to Trotsky.
Please.
Breaking down what I think are his core views on fascism, he sees it as a counter-revolutionary mass movement. It's not just the elite, a dictatorship of the elite. It was a mass movement of the petite bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, the sort of middle class, the shopkeepers, the small farmers,
artisans,
the people that weren't rich, but they weren't the poor working class. They're in the middle.
Right.
And they're radicalized by some sort of crisis where they're motivated to smash the organized working class that were unionizing or starting to demand higher wages, better working conditions. They were, being organized by socialist parties, communist parties, and that was a threat to the wealth of the rising middle class. And it's hard not to see analogy with that with the DEI pushback in the US.
Absolutely.
There's like this, we need to stop the women and the minorities and all this kind of stuff because somehow they're a threat to, I don't know, white middle class men and women.
Right.
He also sees violence as essential to fascism.
It's acceptable.
It's not just incidental, it's the point.
Exactly.
To use violence to crush this rising organization of the working class. You had to have terror in the streets to break, in his case, in the 20th century version, unions, socialist parties, democratic institutions. Again, hard not to see the rise of masked ICE agents running around the US, just randomly arresting people, breaking into houses, walking into workplaces,
no ID.
Universities, creating fear and terror. As a analogy there.
Terror is the point. Just like you said, violence is the point. Terror is also the point as well, because it does half of your work for you. And again, they know what they're doing.
He saw fascism as capitalism's last resort when the usual tools of manufacturing consent, as Chomsky and Herman call it, parliamentary democracy, control of the media, control of the education system, when those things aren't working to keep the people, the working classes in check and keep them happy with their stagnant incomes or their inability to save for retirement or whatever, when people start to arc up and push back and fight back, then they need to be crushed when the usual tools of manipulation stop working. I'm not exactly sure how that plays out in the US because I haven't seen large strikes. I haven't seen large mass movements of workers in the streets trying to overthrow the elite. There's, you have your random protest, but they're fairly peaceful. It's not like Paris where they're setting fire to things. You have had a couple of you've had a couple of moments in the last 20 years of Black Lives Matter and things like that where people have, it's got a little bit violent, but I don't know. It doesn't strike me as there's this mass movement of the working classes to push back against the middle class in the United States, but I might be missing something there. We'll have to drill down into it. And lastly, Trotsky was adamant that it was not just authoritarianism. He's careful to distinguish fascism from other forms of authoritarian rule, like a military dictatorship. And the key difference is fascism is a mass movement with an ideological base, not just a group of generals. Like we've been talking about Cuban Revolution and a Cold War show. This isn't just General Batista and half a dozen of his mates throwing a revolution. There is a mass movement by the middle class. And we have seen that definitely building in the United States, going back to the Koch brothers and their Tea Party movement. What is it now? 15 years ago, during the Obama years, the rise of that. You know, you sort of saw this trajectory out from the Bush 2 years into Obama, the rise of the Tea Party, QAnon, Trump, conspiracy theories, Fox News, all building this, the anger of the middle class. There definitely is a mass movement of the middle class, elements of the lumpen proletariat, as Trotsky calls them, basically the disaffected working class that are feeling betrayed, but they're not quite sure who to blame, and they'll just blame anything, any easy target you give them. And it usually ends up as minorities or women.
Yeah, they're willing to believe. Or they want to believe.
In this case, not the Jews. The Jews can do whatever the fuck they want, including a genocide, and it's all good.
How times have changed. Yeah. No, it's the Latinos, if you will, that seems to be receiving the brunt of this wave of American, whatever it is you want to call it.
So if you're using Trotsky as a guideline, you have a class analysis-based lens. Which social groups are being marginalized? Which social groups are being mobilized? Whose interests are being defended? You know, cui bono? Who benefits out of this? Is it capital versus labor? Is it middle class versus working class? And is violence against workers and worker organizations central to this, or is it incidental? These are some of the questions that Trotsky would push us to ask.
Right.
Well, I think the next step of this is to go back and look at the history of fascism, because I think to understand fascism in the early 20th century, we need to understand the historical conditions and the social conditions that led to fascism. And then we can overlay those later on what's been happening in the United States over the last 30 years and see what the parallels are and aren't. But I think we should leave that for the next episode.